Thank you for joining me, everyone. This is part of my ongoing analysis of anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic tropes and ideas that I hear percolating out there, especially in the wonderful world of YouTube and the internet. And one of these occurring or reoccurring themes is this Khazarian theme, that the Jewish people, or the Ashkenazi Jews, are descended from the Khazars and are therefore not like real Jews in the genetic sense, that we're not descended from Moses, and we're not and from the 12 tribes of Israel or from the tribe of Judea. And I want to put aside whether that matters, first of all, because a Jew is a Jew, regardless of your ancestry. The Jew is someone who is fulfilling by their own life and in every generation the covenant of Moses, the Mosaic covenant, the idea that we're to know God and that we're to take on an extra layer of moral and ethical responsibility as a people of God, and as that's what the idea of the chosen people is, and as such we're supposed to serve as an example to our fellow man. But to get back to the Khazarian theory, and again, not that it matters, but the story is this: the Khazars were a Turkic semi-nomadic people who formed a government or a confederation in the maybe 3rd to 5th or 6th centuries in the Common Era. They came around the same time that the Kievan Rus settled in what is today Russia, and in fact that's where the word Russia comes from. And they were Vikings. They organized that region. And it also was around the time of the Muslim conquest of Persia and of Syria and of that part of Asia. The Khazars were a very fierce pagan people. Apparently they had some kind of a phallic religion. They were very warlike. And it's been said that they actually, because of their warlike ways, they were able to stave off, actually, the Muslim advance into Europe. Had it not been for the Khazars, Muslims probably would have advanced right into Russia and even Eastern Europe and further. So in a sense, they can be credited with protecting the eastern flank of Christendom. But the legend goes that they became Jews. They converted to Judaism. I know about this because when I was a teenager, I read a 13-volume series of books on Jewish history, written for teenage audiences. And in it, there was a chapter about the Khazars. So the idea, the legend of the Khazars is no secret in Jewish circles. It's well known. And I took it a step further by reading a book called The 13th Tribe by Arthur Koestler, which is the definitive book about the Khazars. He did a full research on this. And some of the people that are involved in anti-Semitic conspiracies like to quote that book or talk about that book. When I listen to them, I know they didn't actually read it because they're completely misconstruing it. I did read it. I read it fully. So I can speak to what Koestler had in mind. By the way, Arthur Koestler was the author of, his most famous work was Darkness at Noon, which I believe was made into a motion picture in the 1950s. It's about communism, and he was a very strong and virulent anti-communist who exposed the communist conspiracy to the culture. I think he had been a former communist in the 1930s who saw the light and broke away. And but the idea of the Khazars, the story is as such that the king of the Khazars was looking for a religion for his nation. He had a delegation of priests from the Vatican. He had a delegation of Muslims, mullahs, I suppose, from Baghdad, and he had a delegation of rabbis. The priest They spoke highly of Judaism and they despised Islam. The mullahs spoke highly of Judaism and they despised the priests and the Catholics. And he said to himself, well, they both seem to respect Judaism. I'm going to go with Judaism. That's the legend. And the definitive source on the entire story of the Khazars, which is not easy to prove, there's very little, if any, archaeological evidence that they even existed, is a book by a rabbi named Yehuda Halevi. He was a Sephardic rabbi who wrote about them. I believe he traveled there. He was one of the rabbis in a delegation, perhaps, who helped convert the king. And he wrote a book called the Kuzari, which is a very important book in the Jewish canon, very widely respected. It's a beautiful book. It's beautifully written. It actually has certain mystical elements to it. And Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, of course, was a 13th century Zionist who ended up settling in Zion, or what was then called South Syria. And I think it was under the control of the Turks at the time. And basically the premise was that the king and his royal household did in fact convert to Judaism. They disappeared maybe a couple of hundred years later, mainly conquered by the Mongols, who thundered out of the steppes under Genghis Khan, assumedly. And there's really no modern trace of them. The idea that they were the Jews that became the Ashkenazi is not likely. First of all, I mean, as a Jew, I can tell you, it doesn't seem to be sensible to me that there would ever be a situation in history where hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people would convert to Judaism. It just doesn't seem likely. I mean, because Christianity, of course, Christianity is much more oriented toward the individual and toward, the personal relationship with Jesus and as a way to reach God. And of course, Islam was spread through the sword. They conquered people, they forcibly converted them, and they wiped out infidels. But Judaism is not that. Judaism is none of those things. Judaism doesn't seek converts. It's not actively looking to bring people into the Jewish God. It's not really what we do. And I just think it's unlikely that, culturally speaking, the Khazars embraced Judaism to any high numbers. I certainly don't doubt that the royal family, the king and his entourage, they certainly did. I have no doubt about that. And that maybe some of the people in their capital city may have. But evidence suggests that they did not. And let me just briefly go through some of that. First of all, the predominant language of the Ashkenazi Jews is Yiddish. And there is no element of Yiddish. Anyone who understands linguistics knows that there's nothing in Yiddish that would indicate that there was a Turkic influence or a Khazarian influence. Yiddish is mostly a combination of Old German and some Latin and some Slavic elements, with the Hebrew as well, because Hebrew is actually the written part of Yiddish. So if you understand and you study the vernacular of Yiddish, and it was a common spoken language, it was the predominant language of the Ashkenazi, still is in some circles. There's no evidence that there was a Khazarian influence. There would have to be something in the Yiddish language that would show up. Like, for example, if you study the origins of English, you have some French words in there. You've got some that go back to the Norman conquest. You have some Latin words that go back to the Roman province of Britannia. There's influences because Great Britain was occupied by these forces, and they brought their language, and their language was amalgamated into English, which is predominantly a Germanic language. In the case of Yiddish, there's no evidence of any Khazarian language, it's, as I say. The second factor is that with modern genetic testing, DNA testing, there is no evidence. I mean, the Ashkenazis are closely related to Jews in Morocco, um, and in Spain, formerly of Spain and France. There's no evidence that they come from the east. I mean, the evidence is that they came up through the west, and that in the 13th century, when Spain and France, not just the Inquisition, but there was a more vigorous attempt to convert Jews and turn the heat up on Jews in Europe. The king of Poland, Kazimierz, he would call him Kazimierz the Great, Kazimierz, he welcomed the Jews. He opened the door, and the Jews came into Poland, and they made Poland, to help make Poland prosperous for many, many hundreds of years. They took, the role of various functions, some of them not so pleasant, like tax collector, but nevertheless, they helped the Polish-Lithuanian Confederation, the administration there, do well and thrive for many, many centuries. So evidence suggests that that's where the Ashkenazi came from, not from the east. If anything, they moved east. I mean, how would it be explained that Yiddish, which is a predominantly Germanic language, with some French and some Latin words and a little Slav, how would that become the predominant language of the Jews of Russia and of Ukraine, which is actually the traditional area where the Khazars resided before the Mongols? When the Khazarians were from the Turkic steppeland, there's no Turkic in Yiddish. And again, the genetics don't indicate it either. So this whole conspiracy theory by certain people who are into Jewish conspiracy, that the Ashkenazi are actually descended from the Khazars, and that they have a very racist view of it, by the way, because they think the Khazars were evil, and they worshipped pagan religions like this phallic religion, whatever it is, and that they were warlike and violent, that this is really the true character of the Jews because they're descended from the Khazars, putting aside the fact that descent from any group of people doesn't indicate who we are today. I mean, that's racist, frankly. Putting that aside, the whole hypothesis is really slim. And they base it again on this book by Arthur Koestler, The 13th Tribe, which is fascinating. I recommend it, where he doesn't make this claim at all. He simply goes through the legend as it's described in the Kuzari, which is the only definitive book on the topic, and he takes a look at Russia, and he takes a look at different scenarios. His theory actually was that to the degree that the Khazars did become Jewish, and it's not likely, and he points that out, but to the small group, maybe the 3 or 5% of them who did, he says that when the Mongols came, they moved south into the Caucasus, and they're known today as the Mountain Jews, who live in the Caucasus Mountains of Azerbaijan and Georgia and Armenia. And that is a group. I mean, that's, I don't know what their background is, but they are Jews. And if anyone's descended from the Khazars, it would probably be them. So, anyway, I want to thank you for joining me. This is just an ongoing series for me of looking at anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. And again, this is Charles Moscowitz. Please consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. And my books are available, of course, on Amazon. Have a great afternoon, everybody.